There's a moment that every new mother imagines before it happens. The moment she walks through her own front door for the first time with her baby in her arms. She has imagined the smell of the house, the particular light, the way everything is familiar will look different because she is seeing it now as a mother for the first time. That moment is supposed to be sacred. It is supposed to be the beginning of something. For a woman named Michelle, standing on the front step of the house she had lived in for 3 years with her 4-day-old daughter in her arms and her hospital bracelet still on her wrist, that moment arrived on a Thursday afternoon in March in a suburb outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. She reached into her bag for her key. She put in the lock, and it did not turn. She tried again. It did not turn. She looked at the key in her hand. It was the right key. It was the key she had carried for 3 years. The lock was wrong. Someone had changed it while she was in the hospital giving birth to her daughter. And that someone was not a stranger. It was her mother-in-law, who was standing on the other side of that door, and who did not open it. Stay with me, because what Michelle did in the 72 hours that followed is one of the most precise and completely legal responses to an act of cruelty that this channel has ever covered. And by the time we reach the end of this story, you're going to find yourself asking a question that has no comfortable answer. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you're not already subscribed to Behind the Lie, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let us go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened on that front step on that Thursday afternoon in March, you need to understand the full picture of the life that had been built inside that house, and the person who had been quietly working to take control of it long before Michelle ever went into labor. You need to understand Michelle. You need to understand the man she had married, whose name was Kevin. And you need to understand a woman named Dorothy, who was Kevin's mother, and who had decided, at some point well before the birth of her grandchild, that the house her son owned was more correctly understood as an extension of her own domain than as the private home of a married couple who had every legal and moral right to manage it without her involvement. Dorothy had not arrived at that conclusion recently. She had been building toward it for the entire duration of Kevin and Michelle's marriage, in the particular incremental way of people who mistake persistence for entitlement and who have never, in the full course of their lives, been told clearly enough and firmly enough that there is a line and they have crossed it. Michelle was 30 years old when this story began. She had grown up in Greensboro, North Carolina, the younger of two daughters in a household that her friends describe with consistency as warm and grounded, and the kind of place where the door was always open and the coffee was always on, and people felt, without being able to articulate exactly why, that they could say what they actually thought. Her mother had worked as a dental hygienist for 22 years. Her father had managed a hardware store and coached a youth baseball team on weekends, and believed, with the quiet conviction of a man who had never needed to announce his values, because he simply lived them, that the purpose of raising daughters was to produce women who could handle whatever life handed them without losing themselves in the process. Michelle had absorbed that belief the way children absorb the beliefs of parents who model them rather than declare them, which is to say completely and without effort. She was a licensed practical nurse who had worked for 4 years at a pediatric clinic in Charlotte after completing her nursing program in Greensboro. She was organized and warm and the kind of professional that colleagues relied on and patients remembered. She had met Kevin at a mutual friend's birthday gathering when she was 26 and he was 29, and she had fallen in love with him in the particular way of a person who has been patient and specific about what they were waiting for, and who recognizes, when arrives, exactly what they are looking at. Kevin was 33 years old, a project manager at a commercial construction company in Charlotte who had grown up in the Charlotte metro area and who had, by every external measure, the qualities that made him an appealing partner. He was reliable and even-tempered and competent in the practical ways that matter in daily life. He paid his bills on time. He finished things he started. He showed up when he was supposed to show up. What he had not successfully managed in 33 years of being Dorothy's son was the particular and ongoing negotiation of boundaries that every adult child of an overinvested parent eventually has to conduct. And the longer that negotiation is avoided, the more costly it becomes when it is eventually forced into the open. Kevin had been avoiding that negotiation for his entire adult life. He had been doing it with the particular combination of love and conflict avoidance that adult children in his situation tend to deploy, which is to manage his mother's expectations by giving ground on small things in order to avoid confrontation on larger ones, which is a strategy that works right up until the moment that the small things accumulate into a pattern and the larger things become unavoidable, and the person who has been giving ground realizes that there is no more ground left to give. Dorothy was 62 years old, widowed for 8 years following the death of Kevin's father from a heart attack, and had organized the decades since his death around Kevin with the focused intensity of a woman who had redirected every impulse she had previously directed toward a husband into the relationship with her son. This is not an unusual pattern. It is, in fact, a well-documented dynamic in families where a parent loses a spouse and the adult child becomes, by default and by proximity, the primary relationship in the surviving parent's life. What made Dorothy's version of this pattern significant was not the intensity of her attachment to Kevin, which could be understood and even sympathized with, but the specific ways in which that attachment expressed itself in relation to Michelle. Dorothy had a key to the house. Kevin had given it to her 2 years before Michelle moved in, when Dorothy was going through a difficult period after a minor health scare, and Kevin had wanted her to be able to check on things when he was traveling for work. The key had never been returned. The key had, over the years since Michelle moved in, become a source of tension that Kevin consistently minimized and Michelle consistently tried to manage with the patience of a woman who understood that her husband loved his mother, and that patience was frequently the most productive response available to her. Dorothy used the key. She used it to stop by when she knew Michelle was home and Kevin was at work. She used it to bring food that Michelle had not asked for and to rearrange things in the kitchen that Michelle had arranged her own way. She used it to establish, through the accumulated weight of routine access, that the boundaries of the house were hers to navigate as she saw fit. Michelle had asked Kevin, on 3 separate occasions over the course of their marriage, to speak with his mother about the key and about the unannounced visits. Kevin had had versions of that conversation 3 times. The key had not been returned after any of them. Michelle's pregnancy had been, in the ways that matter most, straightforward. She had continued working at the pediatric clinic through her 2nd trimester. She had prepared the nursery with the thoroughness of a nurse who understood exactly what a newborn needed and who had been planning this room in her mind for considerably longer than the 9 months of the pregnancy. She had arranged her maternity leave. She had stocked the house with everything the first weeks of a new baby require. She had also, in the weeks before her due date, had a direct conversation with Kevin about what she needed the postpartum period to look like, which included a clear and specific request that the first 2 weeks at home after the birth be private time for the 3 of them, without extended family visits, and that Dorothy specifically be given a scheduled visiting time rather than open access to the house during that period. Kevin had agreed. He had told her he would handle it. He had told Dorothy that Michelle needed the first 2 weeks to be quiet, and that visits would be arranged after that. Dorothy had responded to this information in the way that Dorothy typically responded to information she did not find acceptable, which was to express understanding in the conversation and then proceed as though the conversation had not occurred. Michelle went into labor on a Sunday evening. Kevin drove her to the hospital at 11 at night. Labor was long and difficult, as first labors often are, and the delivery required more medical intervention than had been hoped for, and Michelle was admitted to the hospital for a standard 4-day postpartum stay to allow for appropriate monitoring and recovery. Kevin was with her throughout. He slept in the chair beside her hospital bed. He held the baby and learned how to swaddle her and help with the feeding and did all of the things that a present and loving father does in those first days. He also, And this is the detail that became the hinge point of everything that followed. Went home for several hours on the second day to shower and change and collect some items Michelle had asked for. He was gone for approximately 4 hours. Dorothy was at the hospital when he returned. She had arrived during his absence. She had, by multiple accounts, made her presence known to the nursing staff in a way that the nursing staff found challenging. She had opinions about what was happening with the baby. She had opinions about the feeding schedule. She had held the baby for a period of time that Michelle, who was exhausted from labor and was supposed to be resting, had found it extended beyond what was comfortable. When Kevin returned and Dorothy eventually left that evening, Michelle told him quietly and directly that she needed him to be her advocate in that hospital room, that his mother was making a difficult recovery more difficult, and that the arrangement they had agreed on about the postpartum period at home needed to be held. Kevin said it would. He said he would take care of it. On the fourth day, Thursday, Michelle was discharged. Kevin brought the car around. He helped her to the entrance. He put the baby in the car seat with the careful deliberateness of a new father who has been practicing the process in his mind for weeks. He drove them home. He pulled into the driveway. Michelle got out of the car. She carried her daughter to the front door. She reached into her bag. She put her key in the lock. And it did not turn. Kevin tried his own key. His key worked. He unlocked the door. They went inside, and Dorothy was there, in their living room, with a casserole on the stove and a second set of keys on the kitchen counter, and an expression that she later described to family members who related as the expression of a woman who had done something helpful that she did not understand why anyone would object to. She said she had changed the locks because the old locks were worn, and she had wanted to make sure the house was secure for the new baby. She said she had had a locksmith come. She said she had new keys made, one for herself and one for Kevin, and she would have one cut for Michelle whenever Michelle was ready to receive it. She said this as though it were a reasonable sequence of events, as though the natural order of things in a situation where a woman was being discharged from the hospital after 4 days of labor and recovery was for her mother-in-law to have a locksmith come to the house and replace the locks without the homeowner's knowledge or consent, and then present herself in the living room with the new arrangement already complete. Michelle stood in the doorway of her own living room with her 4-day-old daughter in her arms and her hospital bracelet still on her wrist, and she looked at Dorothy. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She turned to Kevin. She said, with the specific quiet of a woman who has made a decision that she is not going to revisit, "I need you to make a choice right now." Kevin looked at his mother. He looked at his wife. He said he needed everyone to calm down. He said they could talk about this. Michelle said she was very calm. She said the talking she needed to happen was between Kevin and a family law attorney, and that she was going to take the baby to the bedroom and feed her, and that when she came out, she expected Dorothy not to be in the house. Then she went to the bedroom, and she fed her daughter, and she made 3 phone calls. The first was to her mother. The second was to her closest friend, who was also a nurse. The third was to a family law attorney whose number she had looked up and saved in her phone 6 weeks before her due date. When she had asked Kevin for the 3rd time to speak to his mother about the key, and Kevin had again had a version of the conversation that had produced no change in the situation. She had saved a number because she was a nurse who understood that preparation for contingencies was not pessimism, but professionalism. She had hoped she would never need to use it. She used it on the Thursday afternoon she came home from the hospital. The attorney called her back within 2 hours. They spoke for 45 minutes while the baby slept, and Michelle sat on the edge of the bed in the bedroom of the house where Dorothy had changed the locks, and Kevin was somewhere on the other side of the door trying to manage a situation that was well past the point where managing was possible. The attorney explained the legal framework of the situation clearly and without embellishment. The house was owned jointly by Kevin and Michelle. They had purchased it together 3 years earlier with a joint mortgage. As a co-owner and legal resident of the property, Michelle had specific and enforceable rights regarding who had access to the home and under what circumstances. The changing of the locks without her knowledge or consent was not, legally speaking, a gray area. It was, depending on the jurisdiction and the specific circumstances, potentially actionable as an interference with her property rights. The possession of a key by a third party, in this case Dorothy, to a jointly owned home was something that both owners had to consent to, and Michelle had never consented to it. The attorney laid out the options available to Michelle in the precise language of someone who has had this type of conversation before and knows exactly what information a client in this situation needs to make a clear decision. Michelle listened to all of it. She asked several questions. She asked specifically about the fastest available legal mechanism for establishing and enforcing her rights as a co-owner of the property. The attorney told her. Michelle said she would call back in the morning. Then she went back to the living room, where Kevin was sitting alone because Dorothy had, eventually, been persuaded to leave. The conversation between Kevin and Michelle that Thursday evening was described by Michelle in the account she eventually gave publicly as the most important conversation of their marriage. Not because of what was said, though what was said was significant, but because of what was finally made clear in a way that all the previous conversations had somehow failed to make clear. Michelle told Kevin that she had been patient, that she had raised the key issue 3 times, that she had raised the boundary issue about the postpartum period directly and clearly and had received his agreement and then watched that agreement be disregarded, that she had come home from the hospital with their daughter in her arms and had found that a person who was not on the deed of the house had had the locks changed while she was in labor. She said that she was not asking him to choose between his mother and his wife in any general or abstract sense. She was asking him to make one specific and concrete decision. She was asking him to call his mother that evening and tell her that the new key she had cut for herself was to be returned and that there would be no key going forward, and that visits would be scheduled in advance and honored as arrangements rather than suggestions. She said that if that call did not happen that evening, she was going to proceed with the steps her attorney had outlined. Kevin asked her what steps. She told him. He looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called his mother. The call lasted 22 minutes. Dorothy cried for most of it. Kevin did not change what he was saying. Michelle sat on the couch and listened and held the baby and did not say anything because she did not need to say anything. Kevin was finally saying it. Dorothy returned the key the following morning. She brought it to the door herself, which required a certain amount of resolve from a woman who had spent the previous night alternating between crying and calling Kevin's sister to express her view of the situation. She handed the key to Kevin, who was standing at the door while Michelle and the baby were inside. She did not come in. She did not ask to come in. She said to Kevin that she did not understand why she was being treated this way when she had only been trying to help. Kevin said he understood that she had intended to help. He said that intention and impact were 2 different things, and that the impact of what had happened had been significant. Dorothy said she had raised him better than this. Kevin said he thought she had, which was why he was having this conversation clearly and directly instead of avoiding it the way he had been avoiding it for years, and that he was sorry it had taken this long. Dorothy drove away. Kevin closed the door. He brought the key to Michelle. She took it. She put it in the kitchen drawer where they kept spare keys. And then she asked Kevin to sit down because she needed to talk to him about the next step. The next step, which Michelle had thought through carefully over the previous 18 hours, and which she laid out to Kevin with the organized clarity of a woman who has spent 4 years working in a clinical environment where clear communication about difficult information is not optional but essential, was not about Dorothy. Dorothy was handled. The lock situation was resolved. What the next step was about was Kevin. Specifically, it was about the pattern that had produced the lock situation and about whether Kevin was willing to do the work of actually addressing that pattern rather than managing its individual expressions one incident at a time. Michelle had found, in the weeks before her due date when she had been thinking about the postpartum period and what she needed it to look like, a therapist who specialized in couples navigating family of origin boundary issues. She had made an appointment for 3 weeks after her due date, accounting for recovery time. She had not mentioned it to Kevin because she had not wanted to create a conflict before the birth. She was mentioning it now. She said the appointment was made and she would like them to go together, and that if he was not willing to go, she needed to understand that clearly because it would affect decisions she would need to make about the direction of her life. Kevin looked at her. He said he would go. He went. They went for 11 months. Their therapist has said, in general terms and without specifics, that the work done in those sessions produced changes that both parties found meaningful and that the marriage is, by her professional assessment, significantly more solid than it was before the Thursday in March when Michelle came home from the hospital to a changed lock. Dorothy did not visit for 6 weeks after the lock incident. The first visit was scheduled in advance for a specific time on a Saturday afternoon, and it lasted 2 hours and was, by all accounts, civil and appropriate, and focused on the baby in a way that grandparent visits are supposed to be focused on the baby. Dorothy held her granddaughter. The baby was not bothered by any of it. Babies rarely are. Dorothy and Michelle did not have a warm relationship in those early months. Warmth is not built in a single session or a single conversation or even a single act of accountability. It is built over time in the accumulation of consistently kept agreements and consistently respected boundaries. Whether Dorothy and Michelle eventually built something warmer than the careful civility of those early post-incident visits is a question that belongs to the private domain of their ongoing relationship. What is known is that the visits continued. The boundaries held. Kevin continued the work of understanding the difference between honoring his mother and subordinating his marriage to her preferences. And Michelle continued to do what she had always done, which was to show up for the things that mattered to her with her full attention and her full capability, and when necessary, with a number of a family law attorneys saved in her phone because she was a nurse and she understood that preparation for contingencies was not pessimism, but the foundation of everything that follows. There is something in this story that goes beyond the specific drama of a lock and a key and a mother-in-law who overstepped in the most literal possible way. There is a pattern in the story that is recognizable to any woman who has ever been in a marriage where the boundaries of her own home were more permeable than she had consented to, where the people who were supposed to be on her side were managing the situation instead of addressing it, where the reasonable and specific things she asked for were agreed to and then quietly not honored, and where the accumulation of small, unremedied wrongs eventually produced a moment where she had to make a decision about what she was willing to accept going forward. That pattern is not rare. It is, in fact, one of the most common dynamics that family therapists encounter in their practice, and the research on it is consistent. The families where it resolves well, where the boundary is eventually set and held, and the relationship eventually finds a form that works for everyone involved, are the families where at least one person is willing to stop managing and start addressing. In this story, that person was Michelle, and she addressed it not with anger, not with ultimatums designed to wound, but with the focused clarity of a woman who had come home from the hospital with her daughter in her arms and had found the lock changed and had decided, in the space of that single moment on the front step, that she was done accepting the version of her life in which that kind of thing was something to be managed rather than something to be directly and permanently resolved. She has said, in the account she eventually gave of those 72 hours, that the moment she remembers most clearly is not the moment she found the key did not work. It is not the moment she saw Dorothy in the living room. It is not even a moment Kevin finally made the call. The moment she remembers most clearly is standing on that front step with her daughter in her arms and the key in her hand and the lock that would not turn and making a decision. She has said she stood there for longer than it took to understand what had happened. She stood there until she knew what she was going to do about it. She said the decision felt very simple once she had made it. The way decisions feel simple when you have been circling them for a long time and finally land on the clear version of the truth. The clear version of the truth was that the house she was standing in front of was her house, that the baby in her arms was her daughter, that the life she had built over 3 years inside those walls was her life, and that she was not going to stand on the outside of any of it any longer. She was going to walk in, and she was going to make sure that the next time she came home, the key worked. And it did. And it has. And that is where this story ends, not with a dramatic collapse of the people who wronged her, but with something quieter and more lasting than collapse. With a front door that opens when she puts her key in the lock. With a marriage that is doing the work it needed to do. With a daughter who will grow up in a house where her mother's name is on the deed, and her mother's key is in the lock, and her mother's word carries the weight in her own home that it always should have carried. That is not a small thing. That is everything. So here's the question I want to leave you with today. Have you ever been standing on the outside of something that was supposed to be yours, holding a key that should have worked, looking at a lock that someone else changed while you were not looking? And when you found out, what did you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And subscribe to Behind the Lie and turn on that notification bell. Next time on Behind the Lie, we're going into the story of a woman who was called a nobody by her husband's entire family for 14 years. They said it at dinner tables. They said it at family gatherings. They said it to her face, and they said it behind her back, and they said it so many times that even her husband stopped correcting them. What none of them knew was that the woman they had been calling nobody had been quietly building something for 11 of those 14 years. And on the day she finally decided to show them what she had built, not one of them had a single word left to say. We will see you there.